Okay, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to our final segment in our 1920s United States history video series. In this one, we're going to pay particular attention to the African American experience during the 1920s, which was significant, not just for the African American community, but for American history as a whole. And we see here our first slide. Our title of our first slide is the New Negro Movement. And what exactly did that mean? First of all, that term was coined by Lion Leroy Rock, a prominent African American writer at the time, to describe the new generation of African American that was coming of age, coming into their own, particularly the beginning of the 20th century. Um, I'll read what it says here, and then we're going to talk a bit about, okay, what gave rise, what gave shape to this so-called New Negro movement of the early 20th century. So our description here says, at the turn of the century, an outspoken advocacy of equal rights and freedom with a new willingness to reclaim Reconstruction-era expectations of full citizenship emerged in the African American community. And we have to compare this to what we know about the situation, the state of the African American community, particularly after Reconstruction, what they were relegated and reduced to after the end of Reconstruction, this deal that the Republicans made with the Democrats. We're going to talk about three tendencies. Tendency is the wrong word. We're going to talk about three currents. That may not be the best word. That contributed to the emergence of the New Negro movement at the beginning of the 20th century. First, the post-reconstruction civil rights struggle as a springboard to this New Negro movement. Secondly, we're going to look in particular at the black experience in World War I and how that also changed this new generation of African Americans emerging at the beginning of the 20th century. And then we're going to talk about, and it kind of happens at the same time of the war, actually before, the role of what is called the mass migration. Or in other words, what initiated perhaps the greatest mass migration of peoples in the United States. What factors contributed to it? And how does this also give shape to, if not a new, at least a newly energized African American community coming into the 21st century, 20th century? Just by its term, the New Negro movement, the idea was this is not going to be a return to the way things were. There's going to be a difference here. There's going to be a change in attitude. There's going to be a change in how willing the community is to put up with the status quo. And that in itself is going to bring a backlash from white society. Let's talk about the role of the post-reconstruction civil rights struggle, because quite often when we talk about civil rights struggle, it's very easy to fall into this trap that it was all about Martin Luther King. Remember, Martin Luther King stood on the shoulders of many men and women that came before him. It's been a long process. Let's talk about that decade or so, the late 1890s. not just incredibly consequential for American history as a whole, but even in the African American community. The leading up to the progressive era. Let's start with 1892, just to have a starting point. Ida B. Wells, activist, suffragette, journalist. She publishes Southern Horrors for the first time, puts it out in the open, a record, a documented record of the problem of lynching in the South. She asserts and demands that these things be known and that someone do something about it. 3 years later, 1895, possibly the most well-known advocate for the African American community, at least, you know, over the years, being Frederick Douglass, he passes away in 1895. That very year, Du Bois graduates from Harvard with his sociology degree. That very year, the emerging Booker T. Washington, an educator himself, a civil rights advocate himself, but a particular brand, a particular way of going about it, he delivers his famous speech at the Atlanta Exposition, very conservative, cast your bucket where you are. And that year, just a couple of years after Southern Horrors, Ida B. Wells publishes an even larger, more detailed The Red Record, further exposing with greater detail lynching in the American South as it existed up to that point, bringing public awareness to it. 1896, the year after, the first legal challenge to Jim Crow laws, Plessy versus Ferguson. Goes to the Supreme Court. Plessy does not win. The Supreme Court says that just because different facilities are offered doesn't mean there's a violation of the 14th Amendment. 1901, Booker T. Washington publishes Up From Slavery, becoming a national household name. He's already known, particularly in African American higher education circles. Now, this pushes him to national status. It's a biography talking about how he, as a child slave, came to be the man he was. 2 years later, his rival for the heart and mind of the African American community, W. Du Bois, writes his best-selling The Souls of Black Folks. 1909, the NAACP is founded. So already a foundation is laid down prior to the emergence of the New Negro movement, of people like Ida B. Wells and Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, laying down the groundwork, okay, for the struggle that is to come. Advocates. Now let's discuss the role of the soldier in World War I, and particularly the African American soldier. I should tell you that as soon as the draft came up, African Americans would show up to be drafted and would be rejected because the unspoken policy was the Wilson administration simply didn't want black men fighting in a white man's war. But as Wilson's need for men increases, he eventually grows flexible and he allows them to enlist in this war. Approximately 370,000 black soldiers, and I'm quoting from probably the most preeminent book on African American history by Lerone Bennett Jr., Before the Mayflower. 370,000 black soldiers and 1,400 black commissioned officers served in the armed forces. A little more than half of these would end up in France, and they would fight in every one of the battles that American troops fought in the beginning, starting with May of 1918. Four of the most outstanding African regiments were composed of entirely black enlisted men. Three of these regiments received the Croix de Guerre for valor by the French government. The 396 was under fire for 191 days, never lost a foot of ground, a trench, or a soldier through capture. And yet, black officers and soldiers were routinely humiliated by white officers and soldiers. More often than not, when black soldiers would enlist in the army with the idea of having had the getting the opportunity to prove their worth as an equal, they took very seriously making the world safe for democracy, hoping that would extend to the United States as well. Many black soldiers ended up being forced into labor battalions or assigned to menial duties as orderlies, stretcher bearers. One particular commander, Colonel William Hayward, as soon as he arrived in France, he took the black regiments under his command and just assigned them to the French. Didn't want them, didn't want to be bothered with them. Our great American general simply put the black orphan in a basket, set it on the doorstep of the French, pulled the bell, and went away. The black soldier in France was this country's unwanted child. And yet something happened. African Americans, soldiers in France, would come to experience a level of freedom and respect that they never had experienced at home in the United States, and this is going to change them. If I risked my life on a daily basis, very much so, accepting the fact that death could be around the corner, you know, when I go back home, why should I be afraid? There was no Jim Crow in France. The black soldier in France ate in white restaurants, lived in white hotels, and dated French women. This is something that incensed the American military authorities in France. In fact, they tried to convince the Frenchmen of their particular prejudices against the black soldier. Didn't really stick. American military policemen spent quite a lot of time arresting black soldiers for the crime of walking down the street with French women. But the black soldier served with distinction and went back home, only to return to second-class citizenship, only to be the victims of violence, the Red Summer of 1919, when black soldier and white soldier returned home looking for work. And, well, in this quote from Du Bois, this became apparent. We returned from fighting, and we returned fighting. The fighting never stopped. Now they had to continue to fight at home for a place at the table, like everybody else. And this newfound courage, this newfound willingness to assert oneself, to demand one's rights, very much so a product of that wartime experience, and very much so plays a role in the shaping of the so-called new Negro of the early 20th century. And lastly, the last event, if that's a better word, that's going to shape the new Negro movement, as it was called, was what people did when they had the opportunity to relocate. And why did they? And how does this change everything? There's quite a few historians that have a problem with the word the Great Migration. It's kind of whitewashed, okay? Birds migrate. Um, Yes, they went up north because when the war started, many men, of course, were called into service, and that opened up jobs. Some of these jobs were filled by women, and some of these jobs are going to be filled by African Americans. Namely, the African Americans were not entirely welcome in the armed services in the beginning. And as the war continues, more men are drafted and more jobs open up. And not only that, as the war continues, increased demand for armaments in Europe creates even more jobs. And therefore, to an extent, women are going to take these jobs, but to an even larger extent, African Americans from the South are going to relocate north to places like Chicago and Detroit and St. Louis and New York to look for those jobs that have opened up, take that opportunity at economically improving their lot in society. But it wasn't just about economics. There were very real, you know, reasons to leave other than economics. And I will tell you, the vast majority did not leave. Sharecropping and the debt and the poverty that sharecropping is designed to create, and the fact that the vast majority, remember, after Reconstruction, we replace, slavery with the prison industry. And those that were not snatched up and thrown into the prison industry the vast majority would end up in sharecropping. And right there, that tells you why so many, the vast majority of African Americans in the South simply couldn't make this move, despite the fact that millions did. Other than economics, they left because they were trying to escape an oppressive society. They were refugees. They were refugees more than they were migrants. They were fleeing terror. They were fleeing oppression. To quote Lerone Bennett again, why did the people move? They moved because the sheriff was mean, because planters were mean, because life was mean. They were pushed by drought, boll weevils, and tyranny, and they were pulled by the lure of employment in burgeoning wartime industries. That's pretty straightforward. All in all, we're talking about almost 3 million people made that move in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. That alone, what does that put us at? 3 million out of 150 million people, more or less. I think that's what the population was at the time. That's significant. Between 1910 and 1920, 300,000 made that move, those that could scratch their resource together and do so. In the 1920s, that number multiplies several fold. 1.3 million make that move. And this continues into the 1930s and to the 1940s. And where are they going? Some are heading out west, but the majority of them are going to St. Louis, to Kansas City, to Chicago, to Milwaukee, to Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. And they're forming communities. The African American communities in those cities today emerged at the beginning of the 20th century as communities of refugees, of people fleeing the South for both economic and social reasons. This is how the African American communities of the North, for the most part, came to be. And let's just not look at people moving in themselves. When people move, let's look at the cultural aspect. When people move, they take things with them. They take a little piece of home with them. I don't pretend to be a music historian, but let's talk about the role of culture in music. If you would have plot me down in this country in the early 20th century, and they would have asked me, what's the most popular forms of music among the African American community, the oldest most likely would have been the spiritual. In other words, church music. Um, would eventually become gospel, religious, Christian themed music. Ragtime. Ragtime is this early prototype of almost piano jazz, but not quite. Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag, the most famous of them. But it particularly among the poor, hard scrabble sharecroppers of the Mississippi Delta, what you're seeing there. You know, that triangle of land between New Orleans, Nashville, and Memphis. The blues was, for at least for a while, the most popular genre of music. It comes out of the spiritual tradition, but the lyrics are not religious. The lyrics are about other things, about, well, just the hardship of life and of being poor and of struggling and of being black. And it shares a lot of parallels with classic country music. You know, I lost my job, I lost my wife, I lost my dog. You know, they don't call it the blues for no reason. And eventually the blues becomes, you know, it becomes more complex. It picks up guitar. Blues guitar is a specific type of guitar playing. It picks up the piano and eventually actual recording artists. And if you look at the path that the blues traveled, the blues being born in the Mississippi Delta among rural African Americans, it takes the same migratory path that the Great Migration does. It travels up the Mississippi River to Memphis, New Orleans, Chicago, and Detroit. But that said, that even with all this happening, the blues might have traveled northward, but the blues audience would always be in the South. The blues would always still be associated with the South, despite moving northward with many of the folks making that move. The blues would still be, always be a Southern African American musical genre. And yes, they founded communities and well, in lots of places, you know, in Chicago, that's a big community there, and in Detroit, and in New York, and possibly the largest of the communities of all in New York. And in a particular neighborhood that's, you know, it's large, but it's not insanely large. It would end up being predominantly African American. It's gone through so many changes, it's had so many iterations. The neighborhood of Harlem. To find Harlem, you would have to be in New York City. You would have to be in the island of Manhattan, north of Central Park. The locals call that area Uptown. And what's so special about this neighborhood, for a couple of decades, starting in the 1920s, this neighborhood, for some reason or another, would be home to an incredible amount of artistic talent. African American artistic talent, uh, intellectual energy, and activism. That it really was an honest to goodness phenomenon in American history. Hence, the neighborhood is associated with this very real moment in American history referred to as the Harlem Renaissance. During the Harlem Renaissance, African American literature, art, music, dance, social commentary flourished. You had a neighborhood just packed full of talented, artistic, creative, intellectual people that had come originally from all over the South and made this neighborhood their new home in the North. And this neighborhood would be the epicenter of this cultural movement, would give shape. If the new Negro movement was political in nature, activist in nature, the Harlem Renaissance is the cultural manifestation The Harlem Renaissance is the cultural manifestation of the new Negro movement. What happens to our African American culture in the midst of a new moment, a new attitude of greater assertiveness in demanding one's equal citizenship? Maybe you've heard of some famous writers that didn't just write, but wrote about the black experience. And wouldn't you know it, there began to emerge an interest in white society as to the black experience in the United States. Zora Neale Hurston, author. James Weldon Johnson, author. Kunti Cullen, poet. Aaron Douglas and Jacob Lawrence, the two most preeminent painters, artists of the Harlem Renaissance. And to live in that neighborhood at that time was an incredible thing, and it doesn't just end there. So it starts at 124th Street and it goes up to 149th. To the west, you have the Hudson River and Columbia University and Bayard University, and to the east, you have the East River and the Bronx. I don't know how many square blocks that is, but it is entirely and completely out of the ordinary, the amount of talent that emerged out of that neighborhood in those several decades. I guess I'm looking at a picture of 125th Street because I see that 125 up there. But that would be a picture of the era. It's not just painting pictures and writing books and prose. It's music. Now let's talk about another genre of African American music that emerges during this period that's actually going to have more mainstream success than the blues, and that is the genre of jazz. And I'm not going to pretend to explain jazz to you, because again, not a musician or a music historian. I will tell you that jazz has similar roots than blues, came from the same places, same humble origins for the most part. But when jazz goes to New Orleans and comes into contact with a particular genre that already existed in New Orleans, which if you hear it, sounds like it came from ragtime. Very brassy, the use of trombones and cornets and trumpets. It's called Dixieland. And when New Orleans Dixieland music comes in contact with, and in the beginning it wasn't vocal, okay, but the piano and the guitar of, well, even jazz guitar comes in contact with jazz. I mean, with blues. What I meant, the piano and the guitar of blues. Then that fuses into another genre, which is jazz, or specifically New Orleans jazz. Jazz is born in New Orleans. And as African Americans migrate out of the South, New Orleans being a southern city, go up to Kansas City, St. Louis, and you end up with Kansas City jazz and St. Louis jazz and different variants. And you move up to Chicago and it changes again. And by the time you get to New York, not only do you have a specific New York sounding jazz, more instruments, more complex. Understand, jazz and blues, these are not trained musicians. These are people that for most part played by ear. Jazz kind of had a tradition of rejecting written music, of playing everything in the moment, being in the moment. Every performance was potentially different because it was basically improvised on the spot by musicians that most of them didn't even know how to read music, if any. That's kind of the idea of jazz, something that emerges out of the moment. And Harlem was no exception. Harlem had their own jazz superstars that would be national jazz superstars. People like Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and of course the most famous jazz trumpeter of that era, Louis Armstrong. So Harlem was about great books and art and great music. Curious white folks would would visit Harlem to see what it was all about. This doesn't mean that racism was gone. On the contrary, I mean, we should say something about jazz. Jazz, what sets it apart from the blues, jazz is going to become more popular in the North, particularly among Northern African Americans. What jazz does do that blues doesn't quite do, jazz is the first African American created genre of music that successfully crosses over into mainstream popular American music. And it does this through two vehicles. Because before this moment, there really was very little, if any way, that white youth would know what the black youth were listening to unless they lived in very close proximity, which really was not the custom. But thanks to the radio and the record player, white youth could come into contact with and explore the type of music the black youth were listening to without actually having to go into the black community. This helps jazz cross over and become mainstream. That's not to say it did so easily and without problems. The popularity of jazz alarmed conservatives who felt that the new music encouraged lawlessness and immorality. People had stereotypes about black people. Hypercriminal, hypersexual. My God, if my white children listen to that music, okay, they're going to start behaving the same way. So there were racist parents that didn't want their kids listening to jazz for fear, since jazz was black music and they associated all these negative stereotypes with black people, their children were going to somehow be infected with these same behaviors through that music. Religious conservatives, fundamentalists, did not really care too much for dancing. Jazz was a musical genre that lent itself to dancing. It is dance music of the early 20th century. To these fundamentalists, dancing looked too close to actual intercourse. Okay? Too close for them to be comfortable with it. Hence, dancing in its nature was tempting, was sinful. But jazz is going to cross over. And the white kids are going to buy jazz records and they're going to listen to jazz music and they're going to attempt to dance jazz music as well. And you're going to have the white parents complaining either out of racism or religious reasons. And then the record companies. They understood the issue of racism in this country. There's only so far a black artist could take jazz music into the mainstream. Only so far. So what if we take jazz music, but we give it to a white performer? How will white audiences react? What happens to jazz is the same thing that's going to happen to rock and roll later, created by African Americans, or hip hop later, created by African Americans. Cultural appropriation, with the understanding that white audiences will be more prone to listen to and purchase black music if the messenger is white. I wish I could explain to you why. I don't know. But, that's how we end up with Elvis. That's how we end up with Eminem. I mean, they could be good people, but the truth of it is, they profited off of appropriating another culture's music and making money off of it. And that was only possible because there was a significant a segment of mainstream white society that would refuse to listen to that music if it was being delivered by a black artist. And that's racism. And if you look at that map, jazz travels the same routes that blues does, except blues mostly stays in the South. Jazz is what goes up north. Jazz is what those northern black communities are mostly listening to. And from this music, new dances came up. The black bottom, the jitterbug. The Cotton Club, that's something to mention. Probably the most famous jazz club in all of Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. And it was crazy because here we are in the North. Technically, the North didn't, you know, follow segregation or Jim Crow laws. But the Cotton Club was one of these rare exceptions. The Cotton Club was owned by the mafia. The only people let in through the front doors, despite being in a black neighborhood, were white patrons. White patrons that went to the Cotton Club specifically to go to a black neighborhood to listen to black music, but not be surrounded by blacks other than those performing in front of them. The performers were black. The most famous, African American entertainers in the world, in the country that time, they came in through the back door. And that was the Cotton Club, or the Savoy was another one. And like I said, the record player was another vehicle for the proliferation of jazz. And jazz is uniquely American. It does not have roots anywhere else. Music evolves, it picks up a little bit here and a little bit there, and jazz is a uniquely American art form. And jazz crosses over, and white audiences also pick up dances as jazz crosses over into mainstream American culture. Dances such as the Charleston, the foxtrot, and even the tango, which has nothing to do with jazz, they become part of mainstream American life, much to the chagrin of religious conservatives. And until today, these dances are pretty much the backbone of what's considered competitive ballroom dancing. But let's not leave Harlem behind, because Harlem is not just about books and art and music. Harlem's about activism also, and you had quite a few activists living in Harlem at the time. Let's look at the two most preeminent figures in the African American community at the time. The ones that command the hearts and minds of millions of African Americans. On one end, he's been around for a while, W.E. Du Bois, intellectual par excellence, one of the founding members of the NAACP, editor of The Crisis, the most widely read magazine in the African community at the time, and we know how he felt. Unlike Booker T. Washington, who had drifted into the sunset already by now, Du Bois was the opinion. The black people had not just the right but an obligation to demand the same equal rights, the same amount of respect, the same amount of citizenship as a white person does. And that the government had an obligation to deliver. Black people are your citizens just like white people. And if white people can make demands on their government, black people can make their demands on their government too, and the government has an obligation to respond to those demands, color irrespective. But now you have a new voice in Harlem, who's not quite a fan of Du Bois' vision of an integrated society in which race should not matter. If you're familiar with the 1960s civil rights movement, Du Bois is very much Martin Luther King before Martin Luther King even came into existence. Big advocate of education, higher education. Okay, but back to Harlem. A Jamaican immigrant by the name of Marcus Garvey is of a different opinion. Of course, he wants what's best for his people, but he just has a difference in opinion than Du Bois does. To Garvey, the future of African Americans lies not in an integrated society, a racially tolerant integrated society, but it lies, in fact, amongst their own. What Garvey advocated was isolation, or better yet, voluntary segregation. Garvey was convinced that whites had no redeeming qualities, that whites were never going to treat blacks fairly, were never going to see them as equals, were never going to give them a seat at the table. Hence, in Garvey's mind, the only realistic alternative is to carve out a space for black people, to be black people, and to succeed and live and thrive as black people without worrying about whether white people approve or, you know, acknowledge or anything of that nature. Take care of your own. Garvey looks at entrepreneurship as a key to this. Take care, let's form our own communities, open up our own businesses, create jobs for our own people, open up schools, educate our own children, worship the way we want, okay? Completely carve out this space for black people alone in an America that's never going to give black people an equal seat, an equal seat at the table. And in Garvey's organization, the United Negro Improvement Association, drew in millions of followers. This message really resonated, particularly in Harlem, particularly in the North, particularly in these African Americans that 10, 20 years earlier had come from the South, had moved to the North, gotten jobs in the manufacturing industry, saw a substantial improvement in their standard of living, and then looked at Garvey's message of self-empowerment, of entrepreneurship, of uh, blacks looking after blacks, and they really bought into it to the tune that that organization became a very quickly a multi-million-dollar organization. You got members of the African American community in Harlem at that time that are outright millionaires. Okay? Black capitalism is the answer to Garvey. Is Garvey's answer to. And it's not just that. Garvey also introduces an element that was unheard of black pride, of redefining beauty and admiration on their own terms, of believing that black is beautiful and being proud of being black. And this was something that was really not the norm prior to Garvey. This is what Garvey really gave the black community, this sense of self-acceptance. Both men are going to clash because they have very different visions. Marcus Garvey goes as far as he also incorporates a sense, not just black nationalism, but black internationalism. He believes that African Americans need to be aware and activists when it comes to the European colonization of Africa and demand a decolonization of Africa. And if the time comes, actually work towards helping Africans, rid themselves of European domination. But, things do get too far, and he does buy a series of used ships from the United Fruit Company. He calls it the Black Star Cruise Line. That was like the largest business venture the UNIA embarked on, with the ultimate idea of recolonizing Africa one day. And of course, you see that uniform there. He made that uniform himself when he declared himself the president of Africa. So, there was some quirky things came about. Well, apparently the FBI found Garvey more of a danger than Du Bois, even though Du Bois was a lifelong, socialist, eventually became a communist. And yes, the FBI raided the offices of the NAACP and would block the delivery of the crisis, but the FBI really went after Marcus Garvey and basically accused him of using the mail in pursuit of a money making scheme, and charged him with mail fraud, and then had him deported back to Jamaica. But Garvey's footprint is going to remain in Harlem of all places, because a good 40 years later, when a very similar figure like Malcolm X emerges, and it's not an accident. Malcolm X's dad was a Garveyite. And it's interesting how the message of Garvey and the message of Malcolm X, I would say a good 40 years separated from one another, both find fertile ground in the same neighborhood. So Harlem was also a place for activism. Absolutely. And what Garvey and Du Bois didn't realize, there was even a younger man that was about to emerge as an activist in his own right, with his own vision for how African Americans should move forward. And that would be native Floridian A. Philip Randolph. If Du Bois' answer is get yourself an education, and Garvey's answer is start yourself a business, Randolph is join a union. Truth of it, most of you are going to be somebody's employee. And if that's the case, and if that's the reality, you need to get the best possible deal you could get. But the IWW was being attacked by the FBI. The AFL had a history of not welcoming black people into their ranks. I mean, when Gompers created the AFL, that was one of the points. And a lot of it was, because blacks have been used as strike breakers, so, why should we, etc., etc. A. Philip Randolph started as what they called a sleeping car porter on the many Pullman trains. And he's living in Harlem, and by the time we get to 1925, we're just going to skip to the good part. A. Philip Randolph creates the first black-led, all-black labor union that is accepted as one of the unions of the AFL, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was one of the largest employers. The Pullman Company was one of the largest employers of African American men in the country. George Pullman considered himself very much a friend of the African American man. He created all these jobs, basically attendants on very expensive luxury railways, except he didn't pay them. They received money and tips, and they worked very long hours. But on the flip side, they traveled extensively, and they made a lot of money off their tips. And A. Philip Randolph is going to be he's responsible not just for creating the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, but for opening the door to African American membership in labor unions, and via that vehicle, economically improving the lives of millions of African Americans. And A. Philip Randolph was a lifelong socialist, and that kind of brought him some problems along the way. When we get to the 30s, that becomes more and more common. You'd be surprised. Speaking of trains, and I didn't mention, the role the sleeping car porters played in promoting the civil rights movement. They would, as the train would pass through African American neighborhoods, and by the way, they made so much money in tips, they were some of the top income earners in the African American communities. Their families were among the best off in the African American communities, and even more so after they got a union. And quite often, they would promote the cause of civil rights by throwing civil rights literature out the window of the train as the train passed through African American neighborhoods. So we're going to veer off the topic of African Americans in the 1920s, kind of taper this thing with a couple of more things. Train travel was still the best way to travel as a passenger. And since we're from Miami, we should discuss this. Henry Flagler and his Florida East Coast Railway ran from Jacksonville all the way to Miami. Contributed to the growth of Miami, contributed to the real estate boom of Miami in the 1920s. Saw potential in extending the train even further south and built the Overseas Railroad, which if you ever take a trip to Key West, you actually see remnants of that abandoned railway line still there. Like I said earlier, the hurricane of 1926 is going to put an end to the Miami real estate boom. And the Labor Day hurricane of 1935 is going to destroy the Overseas Railroad and bring an end to a railroad route into Key West. Two industries start emerging in the 1920s. Aviation and automotives. And after a while, they begin to pay attention and notice the importance of aerodynamics. And that leads us to this topic. Probably the most popular form of not just architecture, iconic architecture and design of the 1920s, referred to as Art Deco, which actually had its origins in France. And there's a lot of influence from aviation and automotive design, taking advantage of very streamlined facades, angles. So what does this have to do with and our local history? Well, you should know 1920s did very well for Miami. Miami Beach as a tourist location emerged in the 1920s. But next time you go to South Beach, I hope you realize you are walking through this country's largest open-air collection of Art Deco architecture. You are walking through an open-air museum, even though you don't realize that. All designated and historically preserved, and very iconic of the 1920s. So whether it's the smaller hotels along Ocean Drive, or the larger once upon a time luxury hotel, the teens and 20s in Collins, you are literally standing, those hotels easily are approaching 100 years old, and very much are representative of that architectural style. And it wasn't just Miami. Two of the most iconic skyscrapers in New York City were also built in the Art Deco style, whether it's the Chrysler Building, which you're seeing there, or the one that we finished by the 1930s, the Empire State Building. Both of them were built in Art Deco style. And lastly, we're going to leave this for a future presentation. How the party came to an end. The stock market crash of 1929, where Herbert Hoover's president, and the Great Depression that would follow after that. So that's as far, so we're done with the 1920s. Today's emphasis was African Americans. And the next time we see each other on YouTube, we will be discussing, why the Great Depression happened and how that would affect this country during the 1930s.